So in the indie space, we have a variety of flavors across different genres. Some have created large communities of their own, and others have created niche spaces for those that want something more unique, but at the expense of popularity. But the roguelite scene has been something that's been booming ever since The Binding of Isaac came around, as well as other titles like Spelunky, Enter the Gungeon, Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, Vampire Survivors, Risk of Rain, Rogue Legacy. The names go on at this rate. The roguelite genre as a whole is like a Diet Coke version of traditional roguelikes like NetHack, Angband, Dwarf Fortress, Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, Tales of Marjayol. These types of games are incredibly complex and are unforgiving. If you die in them, then you have to start all over again, and they never get easier. You just have to get better. Roguelites provide a more accessible window into playing permadeath based games with a ton of replayability due to the utilization of procedural generation and randomized content. Traditional roguelikes have the roots of turn-based RPG games, but roguelites can go from turn-based RPGs to hack and slash to deck building to platformers and finally shooters. Over the past few years, we've gotten some shooters that have not only taken inspiration from the recent releases of Doom, as well as other indie shooters like Dusk and Ultrakill, but have implemented roguelite mechanics into the mix. They have the same benefits of other roguelites, like permanent upgrades and items that carry over into the next run, which makes them progressively easier with each new run. Whereas with traditional roguelikes, you have to get better through item memorization and resource management because nothing carries over. I've tried out a few of these roguelite shooters and they're becoming a favorite type of roguelite for me because of my background in playing a lot of shooters. But I've also noticed that each game that I've played has different approaches to encapsulating the experience as well, and I think that the more of them that we have, the more potential it has to expand onto other horizons. But the idea of permadeath can usually be the one obstacle that stops people from trying out these type of games. Losing your progress is never a fun time, especially when you're close to finishing a run. But as you condition yourself to repeated runs, you can also see where the replayability comes from, and it's that every playthrough is going to be different from one another. Say if you were playing Ultra Nightmare on Doom Eternal, the experience will always be the same, but it's still going to be the static arena with the same spawns that you can eventually memorize. But not as many people will go through that as, say, a roguelite game, and the reason for it is simple. It's the randomized usage of items and content, and the mix of procedural generation and handcrafted content that makes each playthrough different from each other. They also create a gameplay loop that's addicting enough while still randomizing each experience. And these rogue shooters, I call them, here are no exception to that rule. So here are some rogue shooters that I've come to find that are somewhat different from each other, that are based off of different genres. Starting with number 1, arena shooters. So when I talk about arena shooters, I'm thinking more along the lines of Doom, Quake, Dusk, and Ultrakill, with the same structural design to their combat arenas. They're very fast-paced, littered with enemies and resources, and generally have mechanics that you can unlock as you progress. They also have a lot of verticality in the gameplay, where you're encouraged to make yourself as hard to hit as possible while still maintaining accuracy. As a prime example, I've picked up a recent title that ended up getting out of early access, and has become one of my favorite shooters this year, Deadlink. Deadlink is a Doom Eternal inspired shooter that draws parallels with certain mechanics such as weapon swapping, utility combos, and of course the pinata effect on enemies. It's the thing in Doom Eternal where you do Flame Belch or, Ice Bomb, or if you use, the Blood Punch to get resources, or when you chainsaw an enemy. That's what I mean by the pinata effect. It's the same in Deadlink. In it, you play as a character that remote controls a combat shell that goes into a simulation consisting of 4 levels. They each have their own environments, enemies, and bosses. The game is incredibly tight with its controls, and gun feedback here feels nice. Aspects that are essential in an arena shooter, pretty much. The maps are dense but wide enough in space to be able to kite and maneuver opponents. In this game, you'll get used to moving around frequently, avoiding damage and getting kills whenever you can, and charging your shield for grenade hits and abilities. The roguelite spin on this game is not just the permadeath, but also the permanent unlocks and upgrades and implants that carry over, as well as the randomized implants that you can get for each run. The game itself is pretty challenging, especially in the beginning when you don't have a lot of upgrades or implants to take advantage of, but each run yields new unlocks and information on what to do next time. Arena shooters are a genre of shooters that have a 50-50 camp. In the multiplayer department, it's been struggling for a long time, but still has some diehard fans that play regularly. Single player though, it is thriving. And the roguelite spin has been a great addition to an already great genre. This is one avenue that roguelite shooters can gravitate towards, but there are also other games that can blend into the mix. So, what if you had to be fast to survive? Well, this is what I call speedrunner shooters. So, two titles that I've discovered encapsulate the importance of speed and time because your life literally depends on them both. Force Reboot and Dimensional Slaughter. Speedrunning games have been trending on and off for a while, and one other game, Neon White, has had a unique blend of deck building and speedrunning but in an FPS environment. Force Reboot and Dimensional Slaughter, though, takes the fast-paced intensity of arena shooters and puts a deadline to your own health bar. It's quite simple. If you don't move, you die. If you don't get kills, you die. You are constantly losing health in these games, and the approach to them is this: be fast, be efficient, and get out quick. Force Reboot is a short and sweet roguelite shooter where you go from each room, clearing enemies quickly and picking up different upgrades with buffs and nerfs. You have an endless mode and also the normal run where you clear all the floors without dying. If you die, you start over, and each upgrade adds more caveats than it's worth on their own. It has that ultrakill look to it with some low poly PS1 centric graphics. It's a fun game that has its own challenges, and despite the worrying concerns some people might have over regarding the depleting health, you get used to it and focus more on just clearing the enemies and moving on to the next room. Then there's Dimensional Slaughter, a game with an ultrakill spirit behind it, but still being different enough to have its own identity. To be frank, this game is pretty hard. Enemies are really fast, you're losing health, and to get health back you have to kill enemies. But the one thing to keep account for is that it does give you extra lives, which is something not a lot of roguelites do for you. You also have upgrades you can use to give yourself certain advantages across each of the 4 arenas. It's a fun game that I initially had some frustrations with, but once you get used to the rhythm of dancing around the arena and the use of the punch mechanic to gain distance rather than just use it for health all the time, it becomes more manageable each run. The developer is quite active and is constantly working on the game. Would recommend it if you're looking for something that's somewhat like ultrakill but with some roguelite mechanics thrown into it. Health depletion and time limits are just one way to make a speedrunning based roguelike shooter. You can find other ways to reward faster runs, like stars that lead to upgrades or faster times that give you a better chance to acquire a rare item that's more useful, things like that. Arena shooters and speedrunning based shooters are both fast paced and frantic across the board, but nothing in comparison to what you see in bullet hells. So this is a genre rooted in the 2D space. They go back quite a long way, and for those that know of the PC-98, they were the starting point for the Toho franchise to come to life. Since then, we've had games in a similar vein that give you an overwhelming display of particles and bullets that demand perfection in your movement and reflexes. Well, lately, we've seen some 3D implementations that take the same idea, like the upcoming Lunar Abyss game, one that I'm really looking forward to, and Returnal, a third-person shooter with a mix of roguelite and bullet hell gameplay put together. But one game I started up recently that was already around beforehand applies the same thing, and it's pretty chaotic. It's called Tower of Guns. Upon first glance, it had that sort of cel-shaded look that you would see in Borderlands 1, including the dry colours that permeate the entire complex. What caught my eye with this one was the bullet hell based combat, where there's shit everywhere and it becomes a gymnastics course to not get hit while trying to fire back at them. For those that have played other bullet hells like Ikaruga or Nova Drift, or to some extent Cuphead, you take that idea but put it into a 3D space. In other roguelites, you get weapons and perks that you can then use in the next run, but you don't get items that carry over necessarily. You have to start over from scratch each time, and then find those items again later. But some perks and weapon combinations do in fact make the game a lot easier. Bullet hells are all about reflexes and precise evasion. People can often get overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that's going on in the game, and it doesn't hold back either. The only other games that have the same kind of approach that I've seen so far is Mother Gunship and Returnal. I would highly recommend checking out these games if you're a fan of bullet hells or even just roguelites in general. Part of what makes roguelites work is the amount of content that's already pumped into the mix, making people replay the game even in the face of losing their save. You lose a run? No problem. Just load it up again and you might have better luck next time. What comes with content sometimes also comes in the guise of loot. I've had my fair share of the looter shooter realm, with the 3 main suspects for me being Destiny 2, Borderlands, and The Division. They take the addicting loot found in action RPGs like Diablo and apply it into shooters, constantly giving you weapons and armor or other items that lead to some OP builds. But in the case of roguelites, the best examples I have found so far is Risk of Raid 2 and a nice free game called 1 Million Fatal Guns. Both games have a ton of loot, but one is more complex and the other is more streamlined. OMFG constantly gives you different weapons with varying effects. Risk of Raid 2 has various survivors that can all stack item combinations that make them more powerful. It's one of my favourite games that I've played this year, with a beautiful art direction, customizable difficulty and gameplay, on top of the amount of mods made for it. Looter shooters apply replayability in the promise of rewards or legendary gear, which is kind of a gamble that makes you come back for more anyways. In my opinion, these type of roguelite games can be the most addicting because you're constantly getting loot frequently enough where you're being rewarded for just playing. It's why so many people have pumped thousands of hours into Destiny and Borderlands, having the core gameplay loop already fun, and then adding endless loot on top of the ordeal. Of course though, you get to keep the loot and the save. In roguelites, however, items can carry over into the next run, so sometimes some runs are sacrificed for the sake of farming items or unlocking other survivors like in Risk of Rain 2. In the case of OMFG, the main incentive is to collect as many guns as possible, but the experience is a bit more limited in comparison and doesn't have as much replayability as, say, other roguelites. But I would look into these games and see how other looter shooters can be great for roguelites. So we have a few type of roguelite shooters that each have their own spin on the genre, but what else is coming on the horizon? Who knows? Fast-paced games or slow-paced games, we seem to be getting more of the former. The only games that have the slow-paced gameplay and the permadeath mechanic aren't even roguelites to begin with. Games like Rust and Escape from Tarkov has you create characters that have the one life, and while it's not for everyone, some find it thrilling on how much is at stake and how each decision could be your last. But roguelites on the other hand do the same thing but are more accessible because single player environments are usually less stressful, even on the hardest of difficulties. And some roguelites even have modes where you can play with saves and not worry about permadeath. With releases like RoboQuest and Battle Shapers, developers seem to have been catching on to what's been going on within the genre and are trying to pump more 3D titles within the roguelite genre, a genre that's flooded with 2D games. I'm definitely excited for the future of the genre and what's to come, and I'm glad that each release has also been getting more visually impressive each time. We're at a point in the boomer shooter scene where the PS1 aesthetic is getting old, and I think that the next logical step is either early cel shaded graphics or retro graphics from the 6th gen era of gaming. Time will tell what comes next, but if it's anything with the amount of polish of Dead Link or Risk of Rain 2, then I'm right on board the roguelite 3D shooter train. Thank you for watching.